So it is 1 o'clock, so I think we should get started. So hello and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Berger, and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. For those of you not familiar with the consortium, we are one of 15 fire science exchange networks that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. Part of our mission is to disseminate regionally relevant information to our stakeholders in both Oregon and Washington. So we try to do this by offering a diversity of opportunities for people to participate in, and hosting webinars like today is just one way we accomplish that. So to learn more about the consortium or to sign up for a monthly newsletter, visit our webpage at northwestfirescience.org. So to avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio, so if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Also, I will be recording the webinar and will archive it on our website and YouTube channel, and you can find both those web addresses in the chat window. So we are very fortunate today to have a panel of 3 speakers, and it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Pritchard, who is a research scientist at the University of Washington School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. Susan studies fire ecology and dry forest management issues, and her main interests are in the effects of fire and other disturbances on forest dynamics, climate change on forest ecosystems, and management strategies to increase landscape resilience to wildfire and other disturbances. We also have with us today Paul Hesburgh. Paul is a research landscape ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. His primary research interests are the historical, current, and future landscape and disturbance ecology of western forests. He leads a team that studies management influence on forest, the associated landscape changes, and their effects on disturbance regimes, climate change effects on forest and rangelands, landscape resilient mechanisms, fuel and forest succession influences on wildfire behavior, and decision support for landscape restoration. Then finally, we have Nick Povak. He's an on-rise postdoctoral fellow working with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station with Paul, studying fire ecology and geospatial modeling. His primary research interests are focused on various modeling techniques used to identify key drivers of wildfire spread and severity patterns and how they vary across landscapes. So Susan, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
All right, well, I'm happy to be here, and I just wanted to let you know that we also have a number of other teammates on this research project. We have Bob Gray and Brian Salter and Camille Stevens-Rumann. I also wanted to mention that we have a project website, and as our research is published, we will try to post the research results on our website. And right now there's quite a bit of information on there that you can peruse at your leisure. So I wanted to give an overview. I will provide an introduction to our project as well as get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts on state and transition modeling that supported the fire simulation modeling portion of our project. Nick Povak will detail the fire simulation modeling process. And then Paul will kind of bring this to a close by sharing our, some of our results as well as concluding remarks. All right, so for the introduction, this graphic was given to us, Paul, I think was actually part of the creation of it, along with Richie Herod, who is the Deputy Fire Director for Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest. And it shows the 2006 tripod fire, which was just one of so many now mega fires, so over 100,000 acres in size. And the tripod was notable for just how severely it burned through this landscape, both in Douglas fir, ponderosa pine forests, as well as lodgepole pine, Engelmann spruce, and subalpine fir forests. And when I saw how many fire starts were actually in the perimeter that had been suppressed, I was just really intrigued by that idea, as were my teammates. And so we were looking for funding and hoping that JFSP would have a really suitable funding call so that we could kind of explore this idea of what if. So in this case, we have over 300 recorded fire starts that were successfully suppressed within the tripod perimeter alone. And as you can see, many more outside, just outside in neighboring forest lands. And our question was, what would the tripod fire event have been had even just a fraction of these fire starts been allowed to burn? We all recognize that there's some complexities there, but this is an area that is not in wilderness and did not have a Let It Burn program. And so we wanted to use some quantitative data on actual reburns as well as on some simulated reburns to answer that question. Fortunately for us, JFSP came out with a perfect task statement about 4 years ago, and it was about wildfires and how they could be viewed as a type of fuel reduction treatment. And so we definitely got to work on a proposal, and I think it was just such a great thing for us, for one, because I've studied the tripod a lot and I wanted to move on from that landscape. But one of the requirements of the JFSP task was that it would be regional. And so in addition to this tripod landscape, we reached out to fire and fuel managers in central Idaho, knowing that central Idaho had just had an enormous amount of fires. And the East Zone, as well as the neighboring fire to the south of it, called the Cascade Complex, was recommended. And those fires burned concurrently in 2007. Each of them were actually 130,000 hectares in size. So just massive fires. And then to the north, we were aware that Parks Canada and other British Columbia agencies were really starting to think about this idea of fire use. And a lot of it stemmed from a large wildfire event in Kootenay National Park called, not surprisingly, the 2003 Kootenay Complex. And we thought that it would be really interesting to partner with Canadians on a fire there to also kind of do an information exchange and be able to provide what we were learning on the state side and also what they were learning in the BC side. And so our objectives were fairly straightforward, and it was, again, this idea of past fires as a fuel treatment. So we wanted to evaluate the effects of past wildfires on the characteristics such as fire spread and severity of subsequent large wildfire events, and then also really evaluate what these past wildfires might lend in terms of management strategies, such as firefighting strategies, reduction in costs in these other events. I wanted to give you just a visual of some of these study areas. And when we were practicing this, actually, I forgot that we were not going to be able to share these. I'm so sorry, but you're only getting some layers here, and I was thinking we'd have an animation, but the Kootenay landscape is in the back, and you're not able to see very much of it. So anyway, you can come back to us on the actual PowerPoint if you want to see some of these images. In the foreground is this awesome photo that Camille Stevens-Rumann took of a reburn in the East Zone, and you can see the kind of characteristic really uniform regeneration in the background. And that's pretty typical. We'll get into that in a little bit, where the past antecedent stand is completely consumed by that second fire. In this case, it was a pretty high severity reburn that she took a picture of. And so that landscape is very different because of its lack of snags, actually, in these regenerating forests. So our research questions were, first, how did the location, size, and age of past wildfires influence the subsequent wildfire behavior and effects of these subsequent fires? And in particular, were some of these past wildfires effective as barriers, or when they did actually reburn, did they mitigate burn severity? I have just a pretty simple graphic here showing the 2006 tripod complex in the center. And what I wanted to point out is that at least in north central Washington, we're finding that a lot of these past wildfire events are complete barriers for quite a long time. So it's not always the case, but many of these large fires, even on the hottest summer days and windy events, are bumping into one another. So we wanted to, instead of just kind of note that, actually get some quantitative data on them. And then finally, how do past wildfires influence or inform management strategies? So on the left, I have what we're typically seeing in a lot of these active fire events. This one happens to be 2017 Diamond Creek Fire, where in Wolfdus, we have the past wildfires as a layer, and oftentimes they're so useful that they're displayed on the maps for context to show where the perimeter is reburning or not, and how that can inform fire management strategies. We were really fortunate in our first task to work with Camille Stevens-Rumann on her last chapter of her dissertation. She did her dissertation work at University of Idaho and was already working in the East Zone and Cascade Complex areas. And so for this part of our study, we asked Camille to compile all of the past wildfires from 1984 on, where we did have monitoring trends and burn severity data for them. And her main questions were, where there were reburns, did past burn severity influence subsequent burn severity? And what she found was absolutely yes. And a little bit different results and kind of noteworthy that instead of finding that high severity fires perhaps burned as high severity reburns, such as we're seeing in the Sierras and other areas where we have large shrub fields come back, we didn't find that in these fires. And we think it's probably because of the lack of really flammable shrub fields that can be encouraged with these high severity past events. So basically her take-home message was, regardless of past burn severity, these past wildfires were really effective at mitigating subsequent burn severity. And then we were also able to do some documentation of where and when past fires were barriers. And in general, just kind of the take-home is that they were generally barriers for 5 to 15 years. All right. So moving on to part 2, now I'm going to just give you a little introduction to our simulation modeling exercise. And the system is pretty straightforward. So what we wanted to do, using the tripod complex as one example, is go back to the first recorded fire start that was put out. And in that case, it was 1940, and ask the question, if we use historical weather and where that fire started, let's actually burn that out. So in effect, what we're doing is doing a rerun on the past 60 years of fire management in these ecosystems. And so this is a pretty iterative process. And what this slide shows is that first we have a landscape that is created to represent that 1940s landscape. And then we have the actual geospatial records of where these fire starts were recorded. And we use a fire tool, a fire spread model, to burn those ignitions under historical weather. And then we have the task of actually updating those burn pixels. So with that, we really needed to have state and transition models to be able to grow the fields. So this was really iterative. So for instance, within each fire year, we might have multiple burn ignitions. And then after that fire year, we then grow the fields 1 year older and then move on to the next year's fire season. So coming back to the tripod, this was the actual burn severity for the tripod. I studied it quite a bit, and we found that over 65% of the area burned as moderate or high severity, and from field sampling, those were stand replacing burns. A couple things to point out here are that the fire polygons in gray were where there were past fires, and so that was really interesting to us. And so our question was, all right, so that's what we got in 2006. What if we explore some other strategies? So this is a little novel, but it was actually very much inspired by Carol Miller and others who have done some of this work too. We're doing a wildland fire decision analysis over large landscapes and over time. So generally we use these planning tools to help decide what we're going to do on a given fire. And I was just going to bring up this example here to show that we have some alternatives that we could explore. So one would be absolute no fire, put it out. We also have a full suppression scenario, which Paul will get into in more detail, but it's basically put all the fires out that we can, but there will be ones that escape suppression. And then we have managed wildfires, generally late season wildfires that are allowed to burn. And then finally, this kind of let it burn or managed wildfire scenario under kind of allowing all ignitions to burn. So we were interested in going back in time through our simulation modeling tool and spinning up these landscapes from 1940 to 2006 to see the consequences of these different management strategies on these landscapes. So in effect, creating tripod 2005 right before the big wildfire 4 different times. So one of the tricky things about this was that we had to figure out a way to grow fuels. So, and also have these fuels interact with fires. And so I'm going to move into, I should go back just quickly. So we created some state and transition models, and I put in this slide to say that we already have a handbook on this, and it's available on this link right here, and I'm happy to send it to any of you. But it basically documents how we constructed these state and transition models. We feel like they're pretty unique in that they really work to try to create the fire and vegetation dynamics over time for these ecosystems. So moving into why we actually needed to create this, here's an example of the tripod where the first ignition in 1940 might have been where the arrow points. And so if that pixel burned, we basically need to create a way to assign that that pixel has burned and that now it will move into regeneration and succession. So this slide is never fun to show the first time because it's very complicated, but this is kind of what we scratched our heads over for quite a long time. And we used the forest vegetation simulator and other field data basically to calibrate these state and transition models. I'm just going to step through some of the basics here. On the states 1A through 7A, that's what we refer to as our fire exclusion pathway. So we'd have a very large, well, it doesn't have to be large, but a high severity fire event here, and that then results in state 1A, where the fire behavior fuel model assignment would be bare ground. But there are dead trees, so the standing snags. And then we make an assumption of how long that will remain as a barrier to fire. And then then that naturally then moves into state 2A. And if there's no fire, which the black arrows show, we have basically forest succession over time in the absence of fire all the way to old forest multi-story. If we do happen to have a reburn, as that picture of the east zone so nicely showed, we would actually have that either probably in the state 2A and 3A in the case of a high severity reburn that makes it start over again. And so this high severity pathway in either really early stand initiation or stem exclusion closed canopy would basically burn all of those standing and fallen snags for the most part, and then create a very new state, which we're calling the state 1C. And these blue boxes are a reburn pathway. So in this case, we are basically starting over with some tree regeneration and really an absence of that antecedent stand. And so our assumption, and based on some field work, was that that would be a barrier to fire for longer, and that forest succession might take a little longer because of lack of seed source. So, and then in the middle, we have our middle kind of mixed severity or moderate severity pathway, where if we do get fire in these older kind of fire exclusion pathways, state 4A through 7A, and it happens to be moderate severity, we're going to have a very different kind of open canopy structure that needs to be represented by these states. So in summary, each of these states basically has assignments behind it, and that's why it was important for us to kind of diagram this out and then have them available in lookup tables for our fire behavior modeling. So the state 2A, for example, in our left panel here is the pathway assignment and the state assignment. And then underneath that, we have a stand structural class. So SI is stand initiation. We have a fire behavior fuel model for each of these states, and then a length of time that we assume them to be in in each state. So this is what our lookup table actually is here, where we have a state ID to represent each of these states, a time period that they reside in, and then the structural class, fire behavior fuel model assignment, canopy cover, canopy height, canopy base height, and bulk density. All right, photos are always so much nicer than those pathway diagrams. And this is just showing for the high elevation, subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce, and lodgepole pine pathways, we show state 1A as post-fire bare ground, again with that antecedent stand of standing dead trees. And then over time, succession following that big fire event, and in the absence of fire, state 6A represents the old forest multi-story. Here's a reburn pathway. We had fewer photos to actually represent this, but I think we got some really good ones. So post-fire bare ground in the foreground here shows that most of the antecedent stand, the dead trees, were consumed in that reburn. Standing initiation has less regeneration. And then we've walked through a lot of these stands, and it would be fun for you guys to see this too, where you take a walk in the woods and look at these forests where you can kind of see that they probably came as a result of reburn because, say, in state 4C, there's a conspicuous absence of coarse wood or downed wood at all. And so that's what's showing here is just there's not that legacy of those snags in this forest system here. But in the absence of fire, when you get out to state 6C, it's again old forest multi-story. All right. One more, we also did state and transition models for lower elevation forests, and so this is just showing the exclusion pathway for Douglas fir and ponderosa pine forests. And then I saved the best for last. Here's our most complicated state and transition model. A couple things that I wanted to point out are, first of all, again, the state 1A through 6A shows the fire exclusion pathway. And then what was so impressive about trying to put these diagrams together is that, one realizes that with active fire, there would just be myriad states. They would, of course, not be stacked up very conveniently in 10 to 24-year bins, for example. But another thing that we've thought of is that down here at state 4D, 5D, and 6D, these are more old pine savannas. And they can't exist. You can't actually have that structure without repeat and repeat fire. And so then taking, again, that kind of walk in the woods, we can start looking at some forests that have evidence of these old savanna-like trees and really appreciate that there's no way to have that structure without a lot of active fire. And so it comes with these fire and vegetation dynamics. I tried to kind of impress upon you that we thought through those pathways a long time, and it was painstaking work, but also really instructive when we think about maybe some of the wildlife habitat and other structure that we want out in these landscapes and how they cannot actually exist without fire. I'm probably preaching to the choir there. So to wrap up then, we needed a way to spatially assign our state and transition models so that we could get to work with the fire simulation modeling. And so we used the land fire existing vegetation type as our base map, and we reclassified them into really kind of simple groups so that we wouldn't have to create so many state and transition models as to have it be an untenable project. We did fine-tune this assignment to represent moist sites and dry sites using topographic position, and also whether we were low elevation or high elevation. And then we also, for high elevation forests, we made use of the land fire biophysical setting layer to differentiate between the cold dry and cold moist and also lower elevation, just so that we could get in some amount of fuel conditioning into the state and transition models, as well as just a different kind of successional clock with those. And so here's just a pretty map of that. This is showing the east zone fire perimeter area and our assignments. And so then in the bottom right, we're showing that there's very little that's not vegetated in this, some grass and shrub, those are actually represented by single states because we assume that once a fire burns them, they'll come back to grass and shrub. Similarly, we made that simple assumption for hardwood forests as well as alpine meadow. And then the bottom four, dry mixed conifer, moist mixed conifer, cold moist conifer, and cold dry conifer are actually assignments of a state in transition model that would be very dynamic over time and with fire. And with that, I am going to pass the baton on to Nick Kovac, who's going to talk with us about the Reburn Simulation Modeling.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see. Okay. So if we take a look at our model workflow again, Susan just described the left part of this diagram where we use a state and transition models to grow the forest in time. So now we're going to add our disturbance where we allow fires to burn using a fire simulation model, and we burn pixels over time, and we update the burn pixels, and we reiterate that over a few years or thousands of years. So we chose, for our model selection, we chose the FS Pro model, which is essentially the workhorse behind the Wildfire Decision Support System, or WFDS, which is one of the main reasons we chose this model. But we kind of use it a little bit differently. So FS Pro essentially takes historical ERC, or energy release component data, and predicts future ERCs and wind speed based off these data, and kind of predicts using thousands or tens of thousands of iterations of those data, the likely fire spread over time for these fires. So like Susan mentioned, we actually had historical data, so we didn't end up needing to have to run these things for thousands of iterations. We actually just used one iteration. So it's a bit like just using FS Pro for the minimum transit time for these fires. So the other reasons we picked this model is because it allowed for some stochasticity in the fire progression, and we also needed a command line version to work within our modeling framework. So this is all coded up in Python, so we needed a way to access that model so we didn't have to push buttons for years. And so so for our simulation modeling steps, our basic workflow was at the beginning of every year, we moved forward in time 1 year and either grew the vegetation on a cell forward if it did not experience fire, or for the burn cells, we transitioned them into a new state depending on their pathway group, the state at the time of the fire, and the fire severity they experienced. We needed a way to select the number of fires each year, and we did that by drawing from a distribution of naturally ignited fires from 1984 through 2006 using the Fed Fire database. Then we needed the date for each of the fires, and those dates were drawn from that same database where we had known dates of ignitions for every year in the data. And then we needed a way to locate each of the ignitions, and we used a probability map that was based on lightning strike data for about that same time period. For each of the fires, then we had our historical weather data, so we extracted the weather streams from those data, and then we used FS Pro to model the fire spread for the consecutive burn days until we hit one of two stopping criteria. So the fires were allowed to burn until either 2 consecutive days had an ERC below 55 or up to a maximum of 14 days. So we didn't allow fires to burn more than 2 days. And all of these are based off of sort of initial runs that we had from the model. And then after the fire, all the burn pixels remained unburnable for the rest of that fire season so that we didn't have any fire and fire interactions during the fire season. So we needed a way to calibrate our model. So now that we had all the pieces of the workflow together, we had to calibrate it. And so what we did was track the states in each of the pathway groups over time. This is a movie where you'd actually see the bars go up and down as time progresses, and each of the different states, which are also represented by structural classes, accumulate or lose area over time. This video doesn't seem to be working, but you can just imagine the bars going up and down. So in initial runs, we found that certain states acted as accumulators, where the landscape would kind of get stuck in a specific state and wouldn't ever really leave it. And then this alerted us to the fact that our state and transition modeling parameters needed to be adjusted. And so we kind of tweaked the model a bunch of different times, where we would change the number of states in their associated fuel models. We would change the flame length thresholds for fire severity classes, and we would change the paths between states and the time in states, and a bunch of other different things. So that was the model calibration. Then we also tracked, sort of using a time series, each of these different structural classes. So our calibration period was 1,000 years. We found that it took about 300 years for the vegetation dynamics to kind of equilibrate. So here we show the year 300 to 1300. And you can see interesting dynamics in these, but once we were finished calibration, we needed a way to validate our model. So what we did was we took our historical landscapes from the interior Columbia River Basin mid-scale assessment, and these data were derived from photo interpretation of historical aerial photography for a bunch of subwatersheds across this whole region. And the tripod fire, which we show here, spread through 3 different ecological subregions. And we developed a historical range of variability for the structure classes that combined the data from all 3 of these eco-regions to create a historical range of variability. We were then, so this is essentially a table where we translate that information so that we can compare our 1,000 years of the model calibration step to the range of variability that we see within each of the pathway groups for each of the structure classes. And the idea was to see if we can get good agreement, but not perfect agreement. We didn't want to over-calibrate the model to fit these patterns perfectly. We wanted to get an idea if we were in the ballpark of what we would essentially find historically. And we found that we were pretty successful with that. Once the model was calibrated and validated, we then ran the model for over 3,000 years. And we did this for a couple of reasons. The main reason for what Paul is going to present next is that this provided us with a way to develop many different representations of landscapes that kind of represented pre-1940s landscapes. So these would be landscapes that developed with minimal fire suppression and mostly natural disturbance and regrowth processes that would have occurred at that time. And again, Paul's going to talk more about that next. So this also allowed us to explicitly observe long-term landscape dynamics across environments, and these represented the interactions between natural disturbances like fire and forest establishment and regrowth processes. And just as an example, if you look, so this is a time series. Here we see the different structure classes from early cereal, stand initiation, stem exclusion, open canopy, and closed canopy in the pink, yellow, and orange, all the way to old forest structure classes in blue. And again, this is for different pathway groups. So if you kind of look at the cold moist, just as an example, the cold moist and cold dry conifers, you can see over time the stem exclusion and stand initiation classes build up, and then that leads to sort of a large fire event, and you can kind of see them subsequently be reduced and other structure classes come up. So this kind of represents this episodic large-scale fire behavior that we know kind of exists in these forest types. So we found that the model behavior actually matched kind of what the ecology of the region. And then also for the dry mix conifer and moist mix conifer, you kind of see a little more stable dynamics that kind of result from frequent low and mixed severity fires. So we thought that we had pretty good model behavior. We did this all over again for each zone. So here we can see the east zone complex fires. This is our analysis area. Again, this fire went over 3 ecological subregions, so we developed historical range variability based on the proportional contribution of each of these ecoregions for the east zone. And here we go again with a bunch of time series that show pretty stable dynamics. So it's important to kind of highlight that we use the same state and transition models from tripod. And so what's different here is the environment. So it's much colder here in Idaho than it was in the tripod, and different fire characteristics. So the number of ignitions, the frequency of ignitions, all were different here, which resulted in fairly different model behavior, which is, and we're still exploring this. So with that, I will hand it over to Paul.
All right, in this fourth part here, we're using these models to compare several wildland fire management scenarios. And the scenarios that we're comparing are, one, a complete absence of fire. So this is considered a baseline run where we pull fire completely out of the system and we see what happens with fuel and forest succession, unbridled by fire. The second scenario, we're looking at modern suppression, and here we're putting out everything except those fires that are able to escape direct attack. And these parameters for escape were established by working in Eastern Washington with our fire behavior analysts and fire staff personnel to determine historically what were those conditions, what was the period of time, and what are the wind and ERC conditions for escape wildfire. The third scenario is partial suppression, where we're putting out those fires that are going to be big and bad, but we're allowing managed wildfires in late summer and fall under particular conditions of wind and weather. And finally, the fourth scenario is no suppression, where all ignitions that are occurring and meet thresholds to burn are allowed to burn. So here are some representative results. This is the first scenario where there's a complete absence of fire. So essentially what we're seeing is we're developing a homogenized, layered, dense landscape, and it's comprised primarily of old multi-story forest and young multi-story forest, like you see there in dark green. And this is essentially the sort of landscape that we saw in the tripod burn area at the time of the 06 fire. This is a representative map of a full suppression scenario where about 2% of the fires that are escape initial attack and they're allowed to burn. And so you can see the effect of those fires burning across that landscape. And you can see there's still an infilling of mature and young multi-story forests, but some effect of fires is occurring. This is an example of the partial suppression scenario where we're actually allowing for use of managed wildfire. And you can see in each one of these management scenarios, there's a change in the grain and the characteristics and the variety of patch sizes and forest structural conditions that are allowed. And finally, you can see in the fourth scenario, there isn't any suppression and fires are allowed to burn. And you can see that up in the high country, they're actually burning quite hot. But the landscape supports still a much finer grain of vegetation conditions, and we still see the development of each one of those structural conditions are allowed to develop. And here what I wanted to do is compare for the pathway groups the results of some of those management scenarios. So what you're looking at in the dashed lines for each structural condition, on top here with PFSI, we're blending bare ground, burn, and stand initiation, stem exclusion, open canopy, stem exclusion closed, understory reinitiation, young multi-story forest, old single park-like stands, and old multi-story stands. The dashed lines are the simulated HRV that Susan and Nick discussed. So it's essentially saying this would be the wobble in the system across a range of conditions were the system resonating within that cloud. And that's true. So you're seeing those represented for each of the structural classes. And then that red line is the simulation where no fire is allowed to burn. So we're using that essentially as a sort of a baseline reference. So you can compare against the HRV simulated and the no burn scenario. And then the gray traces that you see in each case are 25 model runs that represent variability in those simulations that we would see for 25 iterations of the full suppression scenario. And one of the things that you see with full suppression is that it's kind of a hit and miss whether or not you have the sorts of conditions that would be representative of the fire ecology of the historical landscape. For example, you see a gradual decline in the stand initiation structure. You see some development of the stem exclusion open canopy structure, and you see that the young multi-story structure is fairly similar, and as is the old park-like structure. In the partial suppression scenario, again, the references are the same for the simulated HRV and the baseline run. So you'll see those red lines be the same throughout in each one of these graphs. You can see, again, with partial suppression, the similarity and the deviation between the historical variation and the no-fire simulations. This is dry mixed conifer pathway group with no suppression. Again, 25 simulations for each one of these things. And you can see that without fire suppression, that you're getting a tremendous difference in the HRV conditions. And one of the things that we're seeing with the no suppression scenario is that the HRV sim provides the natural fire ignitions that would have occurred in the simulated HRV conditions, but the fires that are burning in these scenarios are including the natural fire ignitions plus all the human-caused ignitions that are occurring. And so essentially you're seeing stem exclusion open canopy acting as an accumulator in this particular condition, and that's influencing the abundance of each of these other conditions. You'll also note that old forest, single-story forest was represented somewhere between 5 and 15% of the landscape, and it's now functioning as an accumulator on that landscape as well, to the detriment of all the other structural conditions. These are looking at the cold forest. This is again the full suppression scenario. The same HRV sim comparisons and baselines are now appropriate to this pathway group, and you're seeing that the full suppression scenario is influencing, again, old multi-story forest here is acting as an accumulator, and it's approaching that baseline condition for old multi and young multi-story forest. This is the partial suppression scenario. It's not hugely different. This is the no suppression scenario. And again, you're seeing a landscape that is dramatically overfired by the natural ignitions plus the human-caused ignitions. All righty. I guess we're running a little bit close on time. I'm going to go into some conclusions here and some steps going forward using this modeling platform to do additional work. One of the things that we found that proactive wildland fire management can change the likelihood of large-scale vegetation and fire regime shifts on the landscape. So allowing fires to burn has some benefits to how that landscape will receive fires going forward. We noted that the no fire in the full suppression scenarios, they basically represent boom and bust landscapes where you accumulate young multi-story and old multi-story forest conditions, and these have surface and canopy fuel beds that are capable of really moving fire in the landscape under the right conditions, and that's in fact what we see. And we see that the managed wildfire and the let burn scenarios, no suppression scenarios, have this finer grained patch mosaic that has two influences. One of them is more variety in patch sizes and structural conditions as allowed, and it influences how fire spreads on the landscape and subsequent burn severity. Some management applications that we're exploring right now. We've recently been doing some work with some wildlife biologists looking at how these scenarios can be useful to understanding how different wildlife habitats would be available. For example, in the case of the Canadian lynx, we can translate structural conditions and fuel beds into denning and foraging habitat. This tripod area was an extremely important area for Canadian lynx and snowshoe hare, and prior to the tripod fire, the population numbers were much greater. They're in significant decline now, and so the question there is, can we do fire simulations that allow us to understand what kind of managed wildfire and burning would allow for patterns of snowshoe foraging habitat and denning habitat for the lynx that might profit the lynx better than the prior scenarios. We're able in this modeling system to now take fire weather streams and seed them in not only at the historical rates, but we can also start seeding in increased frequency of extreme fire weather events. And this allows us to be able to dynamically look at fire weather scenarios and vegetation succession scenarios that would represent the kind of circumstances that we would see under climate change. We're pretty excited about this prospect. And finally, we have the ability to take some of these succession and disturbance scenarios and translate them into basically carbon storage scenarios as well, and we're looking at exploring that as well. So this is an example of the lynx habitat study we're doing with Bill Gaines' lab, and we're actually writing up those simulation results for a manuscript as we speak. So one of the things that we would really love to be able to do going forward is to be able to think about using WFDS as a research and development and management exploration platform, where we could basically say in the fire behavior analysis, if you received training layers that basically documented these prior fire patterns, these prior fire treatments, this distribution of surface and canopy fuels, how would that influence your problem attack in a wildfire scenario? So not only using it in real-time simulations of potential fire behavior, but also in an exploratory sense, looking at what kinds of management circumstances are truly influential to fire behavior and to the fire behavior analysis. We're moving towards separating, I don't know if you detected this or not, but in the state and transition models, the canopy and surface fuel succession happens coupled in a coupled manner. And this does not allow us to be able to basically produce fences, surface fuel fences, where it's very difficult to allow reburning because those fuels are succeeding at the same rate as the canopy. So it's our intention to decouple those and run those independently in a new iteration of that model. We're also interested in exploring the influence of past and present anthropogenic ignitions. If you've read Jennifer Balch et al.'s recent work, they've demonstrated that the addition, all other things being equal, of human ignitions has the tremendous ability to change the fire ecology of a landscape, and we're seeing this already in the tripod and east zone circumstances. So what we want to be able to do is to see what is the influence of being able to reduce, eliminate, or simply allow those anthropogenic ignitions, and how does that influence the landscape and fire ecology. We think that there's a lot to be learned there. And finally, we're interested in using the model to evaluate climate change scenarios and carbon storage in a manner that I discussed previously, where we essentially are able to seed in fire weather circumstances that are representative of different RCP scenarios, look at the emergence of the landscape, and then ask the question by carbon pool, what are the storage scenarios for carbon within these landscape change scenarios? This is a list of the Reburn publications we have to date, and the bottom set of the list are publications that are in process right now. Where you see a blue hyperlink, these are draft versions or final versions that are available online. And I think that's our last slide. With that, looks like we have about 9 minutes, Carrie, for questions. Is that right?
That's right. And so, Paul, these publications that you have up here, they can be found on your project website, that Northwest/Reburn. Is that correct?
Susan, is that accurate?
Yes, it is.
Is it on a project website? Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
Folks, I've posted that project website in the chat window, so go ahead if you want to find out more information on the project or look at any of these publications. Go ahead and copy that web address. And so at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions, and it looks like we already have a question. Let me see here if I can scroll up a little bit. Okay. Is this research applicable to the Klamath-Siskiyou region where shrubs are part of the natural succession? Precipitation can be as high as 150 inches annually, and where weather such as the Chetco effect winds are not that uncommon.
Yes, this modeling platform could be adapted to circumstances like that, but the state and transition models for the pathway groups would have to be modified so they're in sync with those growing conditions. New pathway groups would have to be developed for hardwood and mixed wood conditions, and the burn scenarios would have to be adapted, but essentially this kind of architecture would be useful there as well.
I'll just also say that having the reference landscapes available for the Interior Columbia River Basin Management Project, that was so invaluable because we were able to reconstruct historical range of variability. And so being able to calibrate the simulation process to known historical patterns of landscapes would be a critical step too.
Great, thank you. So we'll wait a couple minutes for more questions to come in. In the meantime, you talked about, Paul, refining the state and transition models, for example, decoupling canopy and surface fuels. Do you have any other changes that you'd like to make to the simulation model? And if so, can you name maybe one or two of those?
The decoupling the surface and canopy fuel succession is a really big problem. It changes the dimensionality of the model quite a bit, and that's probably the primary one. We believe we have a project in British Columbia where we're going to have the opportunity to actually do that in the next couple of years. In addition to that, what we want to be able to do is to develop plug-and-plays for the carbon pools so that you can essentially get succession outcomes with management scenarios, fire management and fuel management scenarios, and also ask the question, what's the fate and longevity in carbon by pool? I'd say those are probably the big ones right now. And then the third one is, because we've got a platform now where we can start gaming climate change scenarios, seeding in with increased frequency, the likelihood of those extreme fire weather events by RCP scenario would allow us to be able to ask the question with natural and human ignitions, what's the fate of those systems and their carbon under each of these scenarios. So basically, how different is the fire and landscape ecology going to be under these different climate scenarios, as a way of essentially bounding the practical realities of management going forward.
Sure. Okay.
I'll add to that just in terms of the carbon as well as wildlife habitat. The states that we created were really designed to support our fire behavior modeling. And so for our Canada Link study, we actually created fuel characteristics classification system fuel beds to represent those states, so that then a reasonable crosswalk would be allowed between each of the states and wildlife habitat, because we really needed to know a little bit more about forest structure. In a similar way, I think FCCS might be a really good approach for carbon because it counts for all the above ground biomass for each of these states.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's give it just another minute for additional questions to come in. And while we wait, I'm going to do a selfless plug on a webinar coming up next week. Actually, in 2 weeks, on the 27th at 11:30, we're going to be hearing from Courtney Schultz on the prescribed fire policy barriers, findings from a JFSP project on challenges and strategies on federal lands across the West. You can find out more information about that webinar on our website. I provided that link earlier. Essentially, it's northwestfirescience.org. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think this is a good time to close. And thanks, Susan, Nick, and Paul for telling us about this Reburn project. Thank you for your time. The study is sounds complex and interesting, and I also want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen in. We always like to hear from you, so don't hesitate to contact us with your questions or your suggestions. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.